This is the Fuma 2, and this is a new version of the fan favorite, the Fuma 3. Welcome to Machines and More. I first took a look at the Scythe Fuma 2 back when we tested out large air coolers for the Cooler Master NR200. Since then, it's had a Rev B with higher RPM fans. This one is a brand new version, and they're calling this one the Fuma 3. Today I'll show you what's changed, I'll share my thermal testing results, and I'll give you some thoughts on whether or not this belongs in your next build or your existing build. First off, before we begin, big thanks to Scythe for providing this test sample. They did provide the cooler at no charge. However, as with all the reviews on the channel, I'm not compensated by the manufacturer for the reviews, and this review is entirely independent. They haven't seen a preview of the video, and you can expect a fair and well-researched review. And hey, if you value content like this, please subscribe. It really helps the channel. Okay, so what the Fuma 2 did well was provide a relatively compact, high-performance dual tower in a budget-friendly package. It's quite popular for that reason, and if you are an NR200 user, and I know many of you are that follow the channel here, so thanks for sticking around, but you'll see this and the Mugen 5 chosen quite often in NR200 builds because they are bigger towers that fit in the case nicely and they fit the build. They're quite friendly on the wallet. For the Fuma 3, Scythe claims greater cooling performance from the higher fin density and also better compatibility. We'll test out those claims today. Compatibility-wise, the main change here is to the heatsink, and this change is targeted at those mini-itx motherboards that have M.2 heatsinks that are too wide, and they're also too tall for a lot of tower coolers, like the Noctua U12A, Scythe Fuma 2, so on and so forth. Boards such as the Asus Z690i and the Gigabyte Z690i come to mind. The Z790i from Gigabyte is also pretty egregious. With a heatsink in place, those boards have generally poor compatibility with tower coolers because even the tower is a reasonable width. On those boards, it'll seem like it's sitting way too low and it will not mount because it'll butt up right against that heatsink. To combat this, Scythe appears to have shifted the position of the base plate relative to the heatsink. And even though the X570i test board here isn't a typical offender in that arena, you can see that the bottom of the heatsink would completely clear the board heatsink, even if this were taller here. So compared to the Fuma 2, the position of the heatsink is about 4.5 millimeters higher up, and since they didn't change the total width of the heatsink, or I guess you might think of this as the height when you view it when mounted in a traditional layout, it's going to sit that much higher as well, so potentially that's going to result in some trade-offs on the top of the heatsink. There's also a bit of material removed from the underside of the heatsink where it might make some contact with an auxiliary heatsink here, and that's necessary for some boards due to the upward rebalancing, although I'm a little bit dubious about that one because, you know, you still have the fan here anyway, right? So that still might interfere if that's too high up. Another change here to the heatsink is this thicker tower section. This will typically face the rear of the case. It's roughly 4 millimeters thicker than before, and the forward tower here, it's 8 millimeters thinner now, and the slim fan usually mounts to this side. Top of the heatsink gets a black plastic cover so you don't see the heat pipes anymore. That's similar to the cover on the Kotetsu 3 from Scythe that we looked at previously. Based on Scythe specs, cooler height is supposed to be a tad lower than the Fuma 2's at a paltry 154 millimeters, although in practice, this one measured in a bit higher actually, at 156.5 millimeters, which unfortunately makes it a little bit iffy in the NR200 now. That's actually quite a bit of variance. Even with a vented panel, some interference there. I do get the impression that there's a good deal of variation perhaps with this heat pipe cover and how it sits though, so you might want to keep that in mind. Heat fins are updated too, a bit more fin density here, and I'm including the heat pipe cover for expedience, but the heatsink unit weighs in at about 850 grams versus the Fuma 2 at 750 grams. RAM and rear I/O clearance is similar to the Fuma 2. For RAM, the underside of the rear I/O end of the heatsink is sculpted away to clear the board's heatsink, and therefore taller RAM kits on that side won't usually be a problem. RAM, where it typically is, towards the inside of the heatsink, that won't be an issue either. The Fuma 2's design, along with the 16mm slim fan on that side, all but guarantees that RAM height won't be a hindrance to mounting, although if your RAM is too tall, it can still impede airflow from the fan since it would sit right up against the face of the fan. In the box, you get the heatsink, and the fans haven't changed versus the Fuma 2 Rev B. You still get a 25mm Flex 2 and a 16mm Flex Slim. You get a fan splitter cable, 3 sets of fan clips. The third set is for another fan that you could source separately and install. Typically, it's not necessary. There's plenty of fans on here already, but that's definitely an option. It's nice to include those clips. There's an update here with the thermal paste as well. This is Scythe's Thermal Elixir 3. It's a new product. Now they're even including a spatula, which is helpful for some that want to ensure an even spread prior to mounting. So just nice quality of life improvements here. Scythe does still market the Thermal Elixir 2 and Thermal Elixir G, so if you like those, you can still get them as well. There's not going to be a significant difference or huge difference between them, and you still get the excellent Scythe magnetic screwdriver. Really like this, these come in handy. Mounting hardware includes the backplate and bars for LGA 1700 or LGA 115X 1200. You also have mounting bars for LGA 2011, 2066, or AM5 and AM4. One thing new they're doing with the mounting system, they're using thumb screws with AM4 and AM5 hardware, which is nice since it's much easier to seat the screws first, and then you can tighten them down with a screwdriver. And on the heatsink itself, we now have female threaded posts versus the male threaded ones previously on the Fuma 2. I usually prefer this type of setup since the engagement is a little bit easier when you've tried, looking for the posts on the mounting bars. There's also less opportunity for cross threading when you first start tightening. Installation is straightforward. After getting the bars on the motherboard, you just need 2 screws to tighten down evenly those female threaded posts I was talking about. And typically, you want to install the wider part of the dual tower facing the back of the case. That's how to best optimize the fit here. And then you'll just clip the fans on and hook up the fan cables to that splitter cable that's included and connect that splitter to your motherboard. The manual does recommend that you exhaust out the back. You can certainly reverse the airflow direction and just make sure that both fans are moving air in the same direction. The fans have a very clear arrow on the frames, so it's super easy to check. On that note, the fans do spin in opposite directions. Scythe claims that this generates better static pressure performance. They are moving air in the same direction, provided those angles are pointed the same way though. For those of you with NR200s or looking to use this with one, I noticed that this new heatsink does not fit well with the NR200. Because of the added width of the heatsink, the back frame of the case makes contact with the rear tower and pushes it inwards. It'll fit just because the tower can kind of bend with the heat pipes slightly, and the base plate contact, it's still really not meaningfully impacted. But between the higher than spec height of my test unit and the wider rear tower section, Fuma 3 is actually not a great fit. Another thing is the test board I use in the NR200, it's an Asus AM4 one. The top fans, they fit, but it's tight, and since Asus has a lower socket position already versus Gigabyte MSI on their ITX boards, if you're using those boards, the top fan over the heatsink likely won't fit now because that shift upwards for compatibility at the bottom results in another potential incompatibility at the top, so just keep that in mind. If the heatsink cover is the source of the interference in your case, you can remove that heat pipe cover if you want. It is held in place with a barbed hook, so just make sure you don't damage any of the heat fins if you do remove it. There have been quite a few improvements on the clearance and the accessories and quality of life things here and there, but let's take a look at the performance of the new heatsink. These are the same fans as the Fuma 2 Rev B, so we can easily test at the same RPM and just see what the change from that heatsink is. The test here is on the AM450-800X NR200 test system at the same exact 1200 RPM, tested in a rear intake fan position for consistency with other tests. Here's where we stand. There's a small improvement here, but this is within the realm of test variants. It's good to know that performance should at least be the same with the compatibility changes here, but don't expect any huge improvements, at least on AM4. I've tested a few other coolers at this noise level, and the Fuma 3 is still a very, very competitive cooler at this noise level, and especially when you consider where that pricing is. When we bump up the fans to a higher RPM, 1500 RPM here, the noise does increase quite a bit, and in fact, the other coolers, they can't get quite as loud. But just old versus new here then, right? So roughly the same difference as the moderate noise interval, and that's basically as fast as these fans go. This is the max speed. Yours may go faster, maybe a little slower. There's some variance in there. So higher fin density, higher heatsink mass, thicker rear tower, thinner front tower. At the end of the day, performance is just a little bit better, maybe a squeak better than before, and it's still a great cooler. For acoustics, the fans haven't changed here. The noise is identical to the Fuma 2 Rev B, so feel free to hop on over there to check that review out and have those noise samples. So who is this cooler for and who isn't it for? Well, first off, if you are the proud owner of a buffed out ITX board like the Z690i or the Z790i with a too big for its own good M.2 heatsink, it seems like these changes are directed to you. Here's where I'm a little conflicted though, because from my experience, the changes here actually resulted in more pain points for a case like the NR200, maybe more pain points in a smaller case that's not the NR200, which you might be using with one of those ITX boards anyway, right? So now it's the board designs that are the problem, and there are workarounds for those boards, such as taking off or replacing the M.2 heatsink, or not buying a board like that, right? Even in mini-itx, for most boards that folks had the Fuma 2 with, that was perfectly fine, and this redesign almost seems like it's forgiving a board design issue that board manufacturers really need to go back and rethink. I mean, by tweaking this one to be a little bit more case-end friendly, right? And as a result, I can't recommend this for an NR200 build with the new footprint. Fitment is not guaranteed, nor is it optimal. Right? So if you have a case that's similar, yeah, this is going to be a difficult one too. Board or case interactions aside, it's still a great budget-friendly tower in cases where it fits. In fact, from the brief market price survey that I did, it appears to be $10 US lower than before. So while the Fuma 2 was already a really good buy at $60, this one is coming in at $50 US from various retailers now. And in an era of ever-inflated pricing, if it holds up, a 16.6% reduction in price is huge from Scythe. Now, if you're thinking of getting this for a system with an i5 or Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7 level of CPU power draw, you should be able to keep this at moderate fan speeds and therefore a moderate level of noise. So this would be an easy to install cooler that has a clean aesthetic. And I think you'll be very happy with this one, provided it fits. And the mounting hardware improvements are small, but those important, quality of life changes continue to make this a better cooler. So for those of you that are case constrained or height constrained and you want a dual tower, the Nock to a D12 volt is still going to be a safer, albeit slightly lower performing and a lot more expensive option. So overall, some good changes, some slightly iffy changes from Scythe, massively lower price. If this fits, I think the Scythe Fuma 3 is going to be an absurdly good value for the user. So thanks for checking this review out. I hope it was helpful to you. If so, please give a like. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I'll leave the links down below. I'll see you in the next video.